is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Global inflation is at its highest in decades, with a sharp rise in prices being felt more in Africa than in any other parts of the world. While the economic downturn caused by COVID-19 lingers, the impact is being amplified by the rising cost of food and fuel prices amid the Ukraine conflict, a major source of cereals and other foodstuffs for Africa. Many ordinary households in the continent have been left fighting for survival as it comes at a time when food security was already under stress. The current situation appears to have spawned into a complex and interconnected web, with governments struggling for an appropriate response to calm an increasingly restless population. The food security stress is exposing Africa's underbelly and the danger of over-reliance on global food supply chains. This week on the program, we find out why prices have been rising, causes for economic instability, and possible immediate and long-term solutions. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome back to Talk Africa. In Kenya, inflation hit a 27-month high in May on the back of a jump in the price of essential items such as cooking oil, food and fuel, effectively squeezing household budgets. Despite the surge in the cost of living, authorities in Kenya say there is no cause for alarm yet. CGTN's Nick Mudimba has more from Nairobi.
Kenya's economy has been blowing hot and cold over the years, and the COVID-19 didn't make it any better. And according to Central Bank of Kenya Governor Patrick Njoroge, Kenya's economy is poised to grow at 5.7% in 2022 compared to 7.5% in 2021. Now, key drivers of the industry, of course, the main indicators show that education system, transportation, hotel industries are now back from the shackles of COVID-19. But there's one thing: inflation is biting hard in the country. So what's the relation between economic growth and inflation in Kenya?
Kenyan inflation moved closer to the ceiling of the central bank's target range in May as prices of food and basic goods, including laundry soap, soared. The government has said an inflation target ranged between 2.5% and 7.5%.
Inflation to growth, etc., really all those things, the channels are clear, right? But I think the most important one that I would put out there is consumer confidence, and indeed also confidence of investors. It shows that really the macro is the macroeconomics or the macroeconomy is sort of out of work, meaning weak.
According to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, the annual inflation rate climbed to 7.1% from 6.5% in April. That's the highest level since February 2020. Experts warn the high cost of living is now being felt across the country.
Our economy is designed in such a way that there's a small proportion of people that you can almost say hold quite a big chunk of our GDP or our economy. Then there's these many people who benefit or have a very small proportion of it. And now those are the people who, when they hear that the economy is growing by 5.7%, they wonder what you're talking about. Because for them, money is less and less in their pockets. For them, when they want to go out there and buy things, prices keep going. And in people's minds, economic growth is supposed to mean that we have more money or things are cheaper and stuff like that. So inflation is one of the things that is making people not understand when you're saying that the economy is growing.
According to new projections by the African Development Bank, Kenya's real GDP growth will next year trail the performance of its East Africa community partners, except Tanzania and Burundi, partly hurt by inflationary pressures. The effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has led to a surge in the cost of fuel and basic commodities, is beginning to hurt many economies in Africa. Majority have now been forced to cut back spending on non-essential items and are hoping the situation will improve quickly so that they can have an extra income which will improve the purchasing power. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
We have a lot to discuss, so let's now bring in our panel. Joining us from Abuja is Julius Ogar, agricultural expert and agripreneur. In Washington, D.C., joining via Zoom, Dr. Holger Cray, Practice Manager for Agriculture and Food Security at the World Bank. And joining us also via Zoom in Buea, Cameroon, is Dr. Ernest Molua, Director for the Center for Independence Development Research. A very warm welcome to all of you. And let me begin with you, Julius. What is causing this surge in global food and fuel prices?
Yes, there's a crisis in global food and energy occasioned by the war in Ukraine and Russia, and it's having a ripple effect across many parts of the world. You know that Russia and Ukraine, between them, produce about 30% of the world's cereal and grains. And cereals and grains account for about 40% of the world's energy source. So with these two countries in a conflict means there's the ripple effect of the immediate now is that there's going to be food shortages over a span of 2 to 3 years or more, depending on how far this crisis is going to last, because it actually means there is no more production of grains, and it actually means there will be no export of grains, and it also means that there will be no supply of food to those areas of the world that usually get these supplies from that source. So this implication doesn't bode well, especially for countries in Africa. So, and it's for the world's political leaders to also learn that a crisis in one part of the world is a crisis for all of the world. We can use our body, our anatomy as an example. A pain in one part of the body is a pain to all of the body. So the sooner we can resolve this crisis, the better for the world.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Cray. So we've been talking about the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the conflict in Ukraine. But besides this, what are the factors that are contributing to this crisis?
The effects of the Ukraine war has added to nervousness in markets and has given another rise to key prices, particularly for food, for fuel, and consequently for fertilizer. But had we had the same discussion a little before that, we would of course have had much more of a COVID-centric discussion. COVID led to this severe disruption of agriculture markets and of agriculture production. And then later, a much faster than expected COVID recovery created more demand in markets than logistics were able to supply. But let me even move beyond that. Had we had this discussion 3 years ago, we would have been very concerned, and this is my key concern, that for about the past 10 years, the effects of climate change have led to a reduction in per capita food production and to an increase in the volatilities or the nervousness of markets.
Right, so let me bring in Dr. Molua in Cameroon. Dr. Molua, Africa hosts 60% of the world's arable land. And just to take you back in the 1970s, this was a continent that was relatively food secure. But that has now changed from being food secure in the 1970s to now being a net importer of food in 2022. What happened?
I think this is very, very interesting in the sense that whether it is COVID-19, whether it is climate change, whether it is the war in Ukraine, we have a long trajectory of African agriculture and food supplies being barely self-sufficient with the absence of surpluses. This is because we have not been able to exploit the supply response capacity in African agriculture. In African agriculture and food production systems, the supply response is very, very weak. What has caused the supply response to be very, very weak? We have clear policy failures, and we have poor linkage to the market. Policy has not been able to respond in the last 50 years in most African countries to keep pace with the Malthusian basic population growth and population explosion and other drivers like the pandemic and like climate change. So we need policy which is very, very responsive to the needs of the sector. The extension service systems, the supply of basic inputs of seeds, farm chemicals, access to the market, infrastructure that leads farmers and agricultural production systems to the market, roads, storage facilities are still barely inadequate. The agricultural sector has not been prioritized by policy, over the last 50 years. So this is what I call basically policy failure and the exploitation of the agricultural sector, because when the prices are good for agricultural commodities, especially for the export crops, government gains a lot from that, benefits from it, taps from it in the sense of using that to show up budgetary expenditures. But however, after that, governments go to sleep, and that the investments are not prioritized into the agricultural sector to provide the basic infrastructural needs which that sector needs.
All right, so let me bring you again, Dr. Cray, because what we're hearing from Dr. Molo is about what governments need to do to cushion their people. So what we know is that African governments generally tend to have a funding gap, and lots of communities in most African societies have struggled with poverty for decades. And so what we see is a lack of a support system, both on the government level and community as well, to support these vulnerable families. How involved is the World Bank with African governments when it comes to creating solutions to mitigating effects on the people?
The World Bank is very involved. We were invited by the African Union Commission and several governments to join the dialogue on food security, on food systems resilience. Not only have we been one of the parties of the Africa Food Security Leadership Dialogue 2019, not only are we part of the African Union Commission's task force on food prices, but the really good news is that just yesterday, the Board of Executive Directors of the World Bank approved the largest ever food systems resilience program for Eastern and Southern Africa. 2.3 billion US dollar equivalent have been committed to supporting countries in the quest for food systems resilience. And this complements a similar facility that already exists for West Africa in the order of 800 million US dollars. So if we summarize, the World Bank at this point in time supports its member countries with 3 billion US dollar to conduct investments into the key areas of enhancing production, productivity, knowledge, investing into natural resources as soil, water, and biodiversity are so important, but also getting to market. And that is coordination between producers, processors, and the market, but also the much needed infrastructure to supply to the cities and to the markets.
All right. Okay, let me come to you, because I know you're an agripreneur, you're very much involved with farmers on the ground. And one of the many challenges that farmers in Africa face, will tell you, like we've mentioned before, it's access to markets for investors, potential investors. They'll talk about accessing the farms, you know, to perhaps give technology or equipment that is crucial to these farmers. And I just want to know, for you, engaged with farmers there in Nigeria, how do you navigate around some of these problems?
So the problem of access to markets in Nigeria in particular is really a delicate one. It's a delicate balance, kind of, and it's on both sides of the farmers and the authorities, the government, as it were. On one side is the question of infrastructure, and by infrastructure we're still talking about the basic things like roads and transportation and preservation of harvests. The farmers have the challenge of having to, you know, move these things in bulk to the points where they can actually get the monetary value for them. And added to this challenge is the fact that there are no processing industries in our economy. A lot of food comes to waste because there's no processing. So the actual challenge of hunger also lies in the fact that we should be able to convert a lot of what is produced into finished products to move them into the market at value added. Where that does not obtain, it means we struggle, we produce this food, and we have to give it, use it at giveaway value, get minimum return for what we have, and you know, the cycle of, the vicious cycle of hunger is actually not properly addressed. So you now see it could be that there is food availability, but then the challenge becomes food distribution.
Okay, let me jump in there and bring in Dr. Mulwa, because this is what very important, what Julius is talking about. Food in Africa is there, but distribution is the problem. And so that is my question to you, Dr. Mulwa. Why is there a problem connecting areas with food deficit to those with a surplus?
Because of the historic neglect in which policy and governance has been externally driven and comprising essentially of policy initiatives that are outward looking. In most African countries, the colonial trade routes still exist. Most of the railways link the hinterland straight to the seaports. Um, most of the road infrastructure link the major cities right down to the seaports or to the airports. Um, Internally, there has been very little effort to connect even parallel cities, either with railways, which is cheaper to move goods and cargo in particular, but an over-reliance on old colonial infrastructure. So this has become Africa's Achilles heel. And because of that over-reliance on maintaining colonial architecture and colonial infrastructure, it has made it so difficult to move goods, commodities from rural areas into parallel cities. The effort on the agricultural sector has largely been on export commodities of cocoa, coffee, rubber, banana, and little effort has been put um, to prioritize indigenous African commodities, especially the tubers, which are heavily consumed in West and Central Africa, and that form part of the staples, even in some other parts of the continent. There is an over-reliance on cereals, you know, because cereals also are externally driven, export related, import related, but indigenous commodities have been neglected. So with that neglect of indigenous commodities, so much effort has not been put to construct and build the infrastructure, particularly roads and storage facilities that can move these local commodities between our cities, between our towns and villages.
All right, and on that note, let's take a short break. And when we come back, we will look into the danger of over-reliance on the global food supply chain, immediate and short-term solutions to bring food prices down, as well as what can be done to make Africa self-reliant. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa, and let's continue with the discussion. Still joining me in Abuja, Julius Ogar, agricultural expert and agripreneur. In Washington, D.C., joining via Zoom, Dr. Holger Cray, practice manager for agriculture and food security at the World Bank. And joining us also via Zoom in Buea, Cameroon, is Dr. Ernest Molua, director for the Center for Independence Development Research. Okay, let me bring you in, Dr. Cray, because listening to Dr. Molua and Julius talking, there's quite a number of things that catch my attention. Number one, we're talking about wastage of food because there's either lack of value addition or just basic things like proper storage. Now, some governments will say, look, we don't have the capacity and the infrastructure to build some of the things that maybe are required, like cold storage. I know you're very much involved in strategy when it comes to sustainable development in Africa. So what are some of those strategies that African governments can put in place to ensure that even that rural farmer who produces food, that food doesn't go to waste and they can access the markets, or they simply can do value addition and get a better coin?
Dr. Molua has been making a tremendously important point, that the challenge of getting food to market, and particularly to deficit regions, is a function of two key concerns: an infrastructure concern and a policy concern. So let me take these separately. The infrastructure concern, and this, now I'm not talking about transport infrastructure per se, as Dr. Molua has been covering that extensively. There's also a question around storage infrastructure and, as you allude to, processing infrastructure. For far too long, have certain governments and specialists believed that it is sufficient to have central statal storage facilities and then trade integrate out of those. I think what we have neglected and what is being reconsidered in the face of a more turbulent weather environment is actually decentral storage, farm-based storage, so that farmers do not have to sell their harvest immediately upon harvest date to traders, but can keep them in store, have them as a food security reserve, but also decide to sell at times when prices go up so that the farmers themselves can benefit from higher prices. Second, processed, packaged, perishable foods. Urban Africans at this point in time, 66% of the foods they buy are already these processed, packaged, perishable foods. And we cannot leave it just to foreign places or to central facilities to conduct this processing. I think a very important part, and this is where the new Food Systems Resilience Program of the World Bank actually provides funding to countries and to farmers, is also to support decentral value addition, integration of farmers with local processors, processing, packaging, labeling. And finally, cooling and quality infrastructure, logistics centers, but with more sophisticated food items that are perishable. The third of my 3 Ps, cooling infrastructure, is tremendously important. A last final word quickly on the policy side of it. We unfortunately still see that governments revert to trade restrictions. And this is more prevalent in Africa than on any other continent. In Southeastern Africa, for instance, the maize producing countries, we see countries routinely, some of them, reverting to export bans, which doesn't help trade integration with neighbors, which doesn't, as I said earlier, provide incentives for domestic farmers to produce more because export restrictions limit prices. Overall, my team just ran a comparison between the reaction of emerging and developing economies and the more industrial economies to the current price turbulence. And it is very clear that emerging developing economies try to rely more on trade restriction, which is wrong. And advanced economies try to buffer off the effect more through the measures that I discussed earlier, namely reduction in consumption taxes and provision of social protection to consumers.
Right. Dr. Muller, let me come back to you because there's something Dr. Craig keeps talking about, and that is trade, having unhindered trade. And there's something you talked about. There's an eagerness in Africa to import food as compared to growing our own, consuming our own. And let's talk about that factor of trade. Why is it so difficult to do intertrade or intra-trade within the continent? I mean, for instance, I have been to Western Central Africa. I have seen trucks loaded with food coming from Cameroon, going to the Central African Republic. It takes them a whole week to travel, and then they get stuck on the borders because the clearance state system just takes a long time, so many checks, so many barriers, and a lot of things just to get through. And there's a lot of frustration when you talk to these traders, for instance. So what is the problem, and why can't we just move past those barriers?
The intra-African trade is a big dilemma, and we are praying and hoping that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to be the magic wand that will push governance and policymakers in the continent to break down the barriers that impede intra-African trade. Yes, you are right. Your observations are true. It's very, very difficult to move commodities between African states within even the sub-region. But in East Africa, a lot of progress has been made, and this is worth mentioning. The interconnection and intra-regional trade in the East African community. In the CEMAC sub-region and in West Africa, a lot of effort needs to be put on this to improve intra-African trade. And this is going to be the magic wand that's going to equalize the distribution of commodities and then affect prices, boost up supply, and makes the demand for food commodities being that which can meet the needs of consumers, as well as garner and generate profit for the suppliers. So how we solve that challenge in the years ahead to improve on infrastructure, the road network, the one-stop border posts, checks and authorization for trucks to move through with food and other commodities will be very, very important in the years ahead. But again, our governments have relied so much on foreign-driven agenda. I keep going back to that issue in the sense that it's about how do you fly out commodities which can quickly and easily be demanded, in the Western capitals in Europe, as compared to commodities which can be purchased in neighboring countries. But again, because the banking sector in Africa is not responding to the needs of entrepreneurs, so it becomes very difficult. If you ship commodities across borders between countries, will they pay in time? The rules of engagement, the institutions have to work, have to function properly, effectively, efficiently, so that African states can begin to tap into their potentials. So we have to get the policy right, we have to get the market right, we have to establish the institutions, and we have to see our survival being linked, an African survival.
And I'm going next to ask this to Dr. Cray, because there's obviously a good amount of investment by the World Bank into Africa, working with the likes of the African Union, like you mentioned earlier, $1 billion every year. How do the African people keep their governments accountable?
The World Bank is very, very committed to Africa, and particularly to helping grow a better, a greener, a more sustainable food system. My outlook for Africa's food system is a throughout positive one for three key reasons. First, the market has been changing. The market for agriculture food products from Africa is unlimited. An increasing focus is being placed on the cities. We do not any longer need to target, and Dr. Molua made that point, far markets with commodities that have relatively little profit. The cities of the continent with discriminating middle-class consumers are a massive market and an engine for growth in Africa's agri-food sector. Second, I think that governments and regional organizations are increasingly accountable. I am very excited about the collaboration with the African Union Commission. I stand strongly behind CAADP and its objectives, both on food security, but also on sustainability. And sustainability for me also in social terms. And I see more and more governments taking well-coordinated, well-consulted, well-informed action. Third, due to the advent of digital transparency, social media, I think many of these actions are much better consulted and much better coordinated. But we must not forget that we can only harvest these opportunities if we proactively try to set up a food system that is more resilient to an ever accelerating climate change. Unfortunately, Africa is on the receiving end of climate change, not on the causing side. As I said earlier, food crises that happened every 10 years now happen every 2.5 years. This is unfortunately the new normal.
And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Abuja, Julia Solgar, agricultural expert and agripreneur. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Holger Cray, Practice Manager for Agriculture and Food Security at the World Bank. And in Buea, Cameroon, Dr. Ernest Molua, Director for the Center for Independence Development Research. Now remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.